The iron wheels sang their tireless, monotonous song against the steel rails, a rhythm of relentless forward motion that had become the only measure of time. Clack, 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 clack. It was a sound that could either soothe a man to sleep or grind his nerves into fine dust. Outside the grimy window of the last car, the New Mexico desert stretched into an eternity of baked earth and shimmering heat. The sun was a merciless white disk in a bleached blue sky, beating down on a landscape of ochre, rust, and pale, sandy yellow. Mesas rose in the distance like colossal, flat-topped altars for forgotten gods, their sides streaked with the memory of ancient waters. Closer, the land was a brutal tapestry of thorny creosote, skeletal ocotillo reaching like desperate fingers toward the sky, and rocks that had been fractured by 1,000,000 days of heat and 1,000 nights of cold. There was no softness here, no concession to life that wasn't armed with spines and a deep, stubborn thirst. Inside the car, the air was thick with the smells of coal smoke, sweat, and the fine dust that seeped through every crack in the wooden carriage. It was a dry, gritty air that coated the back of the throat and settled on the worn wooden benches. A handful of passengers were scattered throughout the car, each marooned in their own island of weary silence. A prospector with a grizzled beard and hollow eyes stared blankly at the floor, his dreams of gold likely as barren as the land outside. A family of homesteaders. A man and woman with the sun-weathered faces of folk who worked the land until it broke them, sat huddled together, their 2 small children asleep between them, their faces pale and smudged with dirt. They were all pilgrims of a sort, moving through this purgatory in search of a promised land that seemed less likely with every mile of track laid behind them. In the corner, a man sat as if he were carved from the very rock of the mesas passing by the window. He was large, not with the soft bulk of a town dweller, but with the dense, hard-packed muscle of a man who lived a life of physical consequence. His shoulders were broad enough to block the light from the window beside him, and his hands, which rested calmly on his knees, were calloused and scarred, the knuckles thick. They were hands that could gentle a horse, build a fence, or end a fight with brutal finality. He wore a heavy canvas duster, the color of the dust that covered everything, its hem and cuffs frayed from long use. Beneath it, a simple homespun shirt and dark trousers, tucked into scuffed leather boots that had seen more miles of rock and sand than most men see of paved roads in a lifetime. A wide-brimmed hat, its crown stained with sweat and its shape molded by weather and habit, was pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. His name was Silas Boone, though no one on the train knew it, for he had not spoken a single word since boarding in Santa Fe. He had simply paid for his ticket with a few worn coins, taken his seat in the corner of the last car, and fallen into a profound stillness. He did not read, he did not sleep, he did not even seem to watch the landscape with any particular interest. His gaze, from beneath the brim of his hat, was fixed on nothing and yet seemed to encompass everything. It was the placid, patient watchfulness of a predator, or perhaps of a man who had seen so much of the world's violence and folly that nothing was left to surprise him. He was a creature of the vast, empty spaces, and the close confines of the train car seemed a temporary cage, an unwelcome necessity to get from one wilderness to another. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was just another sound in a lifetime of sounds no different from the wind moaning through a canyon or the crackle of a lone campfire under a canopy of indifferent stars. The journey had been a long, featureless crawl across the territory. The sun had climbed to its zenith, turning the inside of the car into an oven, and now it was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple that offered no relief, only a different kind of desolation. It was in this moment of shifting light, when the shadows grew long and skeletal across the desert floor, that the door at the far end of the car burst open. It wasn't opened so much as it was flung aside, crashing against the exterior wall with a bang that startled the sleeping children and made the prospector jump. A figure stumbled through the opening, silhouetted for a moment against the blinding glare of the setting sun. A gust of hot, sandy wind tore through the car, carrying with it the scent of sage and panic. The figure was a girl. young, perhaps not yet 20. She slammed the heavy door shut behind her, her movements frantic and clumsy, and leaned against it for a heart-stopping second, her chest heaving as if she had run a great distance. Her dress was a simple, pale cotton, now torn at the shoulder and smeared with grime. The hem was ragged and caked with the dark, red soil of the desert. Her hair, a cascade of dark brown, had come undone from whatever pins had once held it, and now flew in a wild tangle around her face, filled with bits of leaves and dust. Her face was pale beneath a layer of grit, her eyes wide and dark, darting around the car with the terrified intensity of a cornered animal. They were not looking for a seat or for a friendly face. They were looking for a place to hide. She scanned the faces of the other passengers, the prospector's vacant stare, the homesteader's wary curiosity, his wife's tired pity, and found no sanctuary. Her gaze swept past them, dismissing them, until it landed on the still, shadowed figure in the corner. She saw Silas Boone. She saw a mountain of a man, unmoving, his face obscured by shadow. To another, he might have seemed the most intimidating presence in the car, a threat to be avoided, but in her desperate calculus of fear, his stillness registered differently. He was not leering, not judging, not even overtly looking at her. He was simply there, a fixed point in a world that was spinning violently out of her control, an object of substance, as solid and unyielding as the landscape he seemed to be a part of. Perhaps in that solidity, she saw a sliver of hope, a rock to cling to in a raging river. She pushed herself off the door, her legs unsteady. She took a hesitant step down the narrow aisle, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards. She clutched her hands together at her waist, a small, desperate gesture. The train swayed, and she stumbled, catching herself on the back of a bench. The homesteader's wife looked at her with a flicker of concern, but said nothing, turning back to her children. The girl's focus remained locked on the man in the corner. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if wading through deep water. Each step was a battle between her instinct to flee and a powerful, magnetic pull toward this silent stranger. The air in the car seemed to grow heavier, the rhythmic clack of the wheels louder, a frantic heartbeat counting down her last few seconds of freedom. When she finally stood before him, she was so close that her tattered dress almost brushed against his dusty boots. She had to crane her neck to look up at where his face would be, though all she could see was the dark underside of his hat brim and a square, stubborn jaw covered in dark stubble. He did not move. He did not acknowledge her presence in any way. It was as if she were a ghost, a figment of the heat haze. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. Words seemed to fail her. What could she say? How could she explain the terror that was chasing her, the terror that she could feel breathing down her neck even now? She swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence that had fallen over their small section of the car. The prospector was now watching with undisguised curiosity. Finally, she leaned forward, a small, desperate bow of supplication. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a dry, rasping sound torn from a raw throat. It was a child's plea, stripped of all pride, leaving only raw, naked need. "Mr." she breathed, the word dissolving almost as soon as it left her lips. "Mr., can I hide under your coat?" The request hung in the air between them, fragile and absurd. A grown woman asking to hide under a stranger's coat like a lost kitten seeking warmth. It was a request that should have earned her a laugh, a scornful look, or a gruff dismissal. Silas Boone did none of those things. His posture did not change. His head did not tilt. The only sign that he had heard her was a subtle shift in the tension of his shoulders. For a count of 3 heartbeats, he remained perfectly still. The girl held her breath, her own heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break them. She expected a rejection, a shove, a curse. She was poised to bolt. Then, slowly, Without a word, without looking at her, he moved. His right hand, that large, scarred hand that had been resting on his knee, lifted. He took hold of the left lapel of his heavy duster. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, he pulled the fabric upward and outward, creating a dark, cavernous space between his body and the coat. It was not an invitation. It was not a gesture of welcome or of pity. It was a simple, mechanical action. A door being opened, an answer given without the need for language. The girl did not need a second bidding. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over her. She did not hesitate. She dropped to her knees on the dusty floor and scrambled into the offered shelter. She was like a fox diving for its den, a swift, instinctual movement born of pure survival. The heavy canvas fell down behind her, plunging her into a world of near total darkness. It was a cramped, close space, smelling of dust, worn leather, sun-baked earth, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. She curled herself into a tight ball, drawing her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself as small and as invisible as possible. The rough fabric of his trousers scratched against her cheek. She could feel the solid wall of his leg against her back, as unmoving as a stone pillar. Through the thick material of his coat and shirt, she could feel the faint, steady, and incredibly slow rhythm of his heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the calmest sound she had ever heard. She began to tremble. It started in her hands and spread through her entire body, a violent, uncontrollable shivering that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the brutal aftershock of terror, the body's delayed reaction to a fear so profound it had frozen her blood. She pressed her face into her knees, biting her lip to keep her teeth from chattering, terrified that the sound or the movement would give her away. Outside her dark sanctuary, the world continued. The train wheels kept up their relentless clack-clack. The sun continued to sink. Silas Boone, the man who was now her shield, did not move. He simply sat, a silent monolith, with a desperate, trembling secret hidden in his shadow. Time ceased to exist in the darkness under the coat. There was only the steady, rhythmic clatter of the train wheels and the slow, powerful beat of the man's heart against her back. The initial, violent trembling that had seized the girl's body slowly subsided, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that was almost as debilitating. She was a bundle of raw nerves and aching muscles, curled into the smallest possible space, her world reduced to the scent of dust and the rough texture of canvas. Every jolt of the train was a fresh wave of fear, a reminder that this sanctuary was fragile, temporary, and moving at 30 miles an hour across an unforgiving wasteland. She had no name for the man who shielded her, no idea why he had offered this silent, inscrutable act of grace. She only knew that his stillness was a dam holding back the flood of her terror. Then, a change. It was subtle at first. Through the thick layers of cloth, she felt the muscles in his back and leg tense. It was not a large movement, merely a gathering of energy, the quiet coiling of a spring. His heartbeat, which had been as regular as a pendulum, did not quicken, but it seemed to gain a new, harder weight. He knew something. He had sensed a change that she, buried in her cocoon of fear, had missed. A moment later, she heard it too. A new sound, cutting through the familiar rhythm of the wheels, the grating squeal of brakes, not the sharp cry of an emergency stop, but a deliberate, grinding deceleration. The train was slowing, and then another sound, heavy boots landing on the metal plate of the coupling at the end of the car, followed by the violent crash of the door being thrown open again. This time, it wasn't a desperate girl who entered, but something else entirely. "Check every car," he said she got on this train, "and this is the last stop for 100 miles. The voice was coarse, gravelly with dust and impatience. It sliced through the weary stupor of the car, sharp and ugly. The girl, whose name was Eleanor, though she had scarcely thought of it in days, went rigid. A whimper died in her throat, choked off by a fresh surge of adrenaline. Every muscle screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. She pressed herself tighter against the unmoving wall of the man's leg, praying for invisibility. 3 men stormed into the car, their presence filling the space with an immediate and palpable menace. They were not railroad men or passengers. They were hunters. Their faces were burned dark by the sun and wind. Their eyes narrowed to slits against the glare and against the world in general. Dust clung to their sweat-stained shirts and leather vests. Each man wore a pistol strapped low on his hip, the holsters worn smooth from long use. The one who had spoken, a burly man with a tangled beard and the name Hank tattooed crudely on his forearm, stomped down the aisle, his spurs ringing with a sound that was grotesquely out of place. A second, leaner man called Dusty followed him, his eyes darting from side to side like a nervous coyote. The third man, clearly their leader, entered last. He was older, with a neatly trimmed graying mustache and cold, intelligent eyes. He moved with a confident, predatory saunter that was far more threatening than his companion's brutishness. His name was Barlow. "Evening, folks," Barlow said, his voice deceptively pleasant. The homesteading couple stared at him, the man moving instinctively to shield his wife and sleeping children. The old prospector seemed to shrink into his seat. "Just looking for something that don't belong to us. A piece of property that's gone missing. Young girl. 'Bout so high, dark hair. You'd know her if you saw her. Looks scared." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his sun-cured face. Hank began the search, kicking at a loose bundle under the prospector's seat. "Nothing here," he grunted. Dusty moved to the other side, peering at the homesteaders. The woman pulled her children closer, her face a mask of fear. "They ain't seen nothing," Dusty reported, his gaze lingering on the woman in a way that made her husband's hands clench into fists. Barlow's cold eyes swept the car, dismissing the others, and settled on the large, still figure in the corner. He noted the sheer size of the man, the way he sat apart, the dusty duster that could hide a multitude of sins. He walked slowly toward them, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the wooden floor. Eleanor felt his approach like a change in air pressure. The space under the coat suddenly felt suffocating, a tomb. Barlow stopped a few feet from Silas Boone's seat. He tipped his hat back slightly, a gesture that was almost polite. "Afternoon. Friend. Quite a journey." Silas did not respond. He didn't even appear to have noticed the man's presence. His head remained slightly bowed, his face lost in the shadows of his hat. "Not much for conversation, are you?" Barlow continued, his voice losing its thin veneer of pleasantry. "We're looking for a runaway girl. You ain't seen a stray filly wandering through, have you?" Silence. The only sounds were the creaking of the train car and the heavy breathing of Hank, who had now joined his boss. Under the coat, Eleanor's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She could smell the sour scent of whiskey and unwashed bodies. "My friend asked you a question," Hank growled, stepping closer. He loomed over the seated man, trying to use his own bulk for intimidation. It was like a boulder trying to intimidate a mountain. Still, Silas was silent. He seemed to have retreated to a place where their voices couldn't reach him, a fortress of pure stillness. This infuriated Hank. Maybe he's deaf, or maybe he's hiding something. He gestured with his chin. "That's a mighty big coat you got there, Mr. Warm day for it." He reached out a grimy hand, his fingers hooking, ready to tear the duster aside. In that final, stretched out second before discovery, before the screaming and the inevitable violence, something happened. Silas moved. It was not the panicked reaction of a cornered man. It was an explosion of pure, focused intent. One moment he was a statue of stone. The next, he was a blur of motion. His left hand, the one Eleanor couldn't see, shot out and clamped around Hank's wrist, stopping the man's hand inches from the coat. The crack of bone and Hank's choked cry of pain were simultaneous. At the exact same instant, his right hand, the one that had held the coat open, shot under the fabric and closed around Eleanor's upper arm. His grip was like iron. Not cruel, but absolute. It was not a request. It was a command. He was on his feet in a single, fluid movement, hauling her with him. The duster fell away, and for a blinding, horrifying moment, she was exposed. Her wide, terrified eyes meeting Barlow's look of cold, triumphant fury. "There you are," Barlow hissed, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. But Silas was already moving. He did not go toward the aisle to fight. He did not go for the door at the end of the car. He pivoted, dragging Eleanor with him, and took 2 powerful strides toward the side of the train. He ignored the panicked shouts of the other passengers and the curses of the men behind him. He was a force of nature, a river breaking its banks, and she was caught in his current. He shoved open the rattling door that led to the small, open-air platform connecting the cars. The roar of the wind and the wheels was deafening. The desert landscape was a streaking, incomprehensible blur of brown and orange. The train was still moving fast, too fast. For a terrifying second, Eleanor thought he meant to throw her off. He didn't. He pulled her flush against his side, his arm a steel band around her waist. He glanced down at the blur of the ground, then back at the doorway where Barlow was appearing, his pistol now drawn. There was no time to think, no time for anything but instinct. "Hold on," Silas said. It was the first time she had ever heard his voice. It was low, rough, like stones grinding together. And then he jumped, pulling her with him into the roaring void. The world became a violent, tumbling chaos. There was a sensation of falling, the hot wind ripping the air from her lungs. Then impact. They didn't land on their feet. They hit the steep, gravelly embankment that sloped down from the tracks. And they rolled. The world was a spinning nightmare of sky and earth, of sharp rocks and thorny bushes that tore at her clothes and skin. Her head struck something hard, and for a moment, stars exploded behind her eyes. They tumbled over and over, a tangled mess of limbs, until they finally slid to a stop in a cloud of dust at the bottom of the embankment, lying in the searing heat of the sand. For a moment, there was only pain and disorientation. Eleanor's body was a symphony of agony. Her lungs burned, her head throbbed. Every inch of her skin felt scraped and raw. Above her, she could hear the receding clatter of the train and faint. Angry shouts carried on the wind. Then, the train sound faded, swallowed by the immense, ringing silence of the desert. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. They were alone. Before she could fully process what had happened, the iron grip was on her arm again. Silas was already untangling himself from her, rising to a crouch. His face, now visible in the harsh light of the setting sun, was grim and unreadable. A long scratch ran down his cheek, welling with blood, but he seemed not to notice. His eyes were scanning their surroundings, assessing, calculating. "Get up," he said, his voice still the same low rasp. He pulled her to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced them to hold her. He pointed. The train was now a dark line in the distance, shrinking with every second, but it was slowing down even more, preparing to stop. They would be coming back for them, on foot, or perhaps on the horses that would be in a stock car. They had minutes, at best. Silas wasted none of them. He didn't look back at the tracks. His gaze was fixed on the landscape ahead. He saw the way the land was broken, a maze of arroyos and rock formations that offered the only hope of cover. "This way! Run!" And they ran. It was a clumsy, stumbling flight. The deep sand pulled at Eleanor's bare feet, and the heat rising from the ground was like walking on hot coals. Silas set a brutal pace, his long strides eating up the ground. He still had hold of her arm, half dragging her when she faltered. He wasn't running wildly. His path was deliberate. He led them not across the open sand, but toward a wide, dry wash littered with smooth stones and boulders. "Walk on the rocks," he commanded, his breath coming in steady. Controlled pants. They won't hold a print. Eleanor obeyed without question, her mind numb with shock and pain, her body moving on pure instinct. She scrambled over the stones, her ankles twisting, her breath tearing at her throat. He moved with a surprising agility for such a large man, his boots finding sure purchase where she slipped and stumbled. He was reading the land, seeing paths and possibilities where she saw only a chaotic jumble of rock and sand. After 100 yards of the rocky wash, he veered sharply to the right, leading them into a narrow slot canyon, a deep scar in the earth where the walls rose up on either side, casting them in cool shadow. The sudden relief from the sun was immense. Here, the air was still and quiet. He paused for only a second, letting her catch a single, ragged breath before pressing on. He moved down the winding canyon, his eyes constantly scanning the rock walls above them. They were moving away from the tracks, but in a parallel line. After another quarter mile, he found what he was looking for, a place where a side canyon branched off. Heading back toward the east, he stopped, and for the first time, let go of her arm. He reached down and, with a quick, impersonal motion, tore a long strip of fabric from the hem of her already tattered dress. Before she could protest, he trotted 20 yards down the eastern canyon branch and tied the strip of pale cotton to a thorny bush, leaving it to flutter in the breeze like a flag, a false trail, a sign for their pursuers that they had gone this way. Then he returned to her, his face an emotionless mask, and led her down the main, western canyon. He was thinking steps ahead, playing a lethal game of chess with the landscape as his board. He knew how trackers thought. He knew what they would look for. The sun was touching the horizon now, and the light in the canyon was fading to a deep purple. They came to a place where the canyon walls were lower, and a thicket of dry, resinous greasewood bushes grew in a dense patch. Silas stopped again. He knelt, pulling a small oilskin pouch from his pocket. Inside were a piece of flint and a shard of steel. He gathered a handful of the driest leaves and twigs, piling them at the base of the largest bush. He didn't say a word, didn't explain. He simply struck the steel against the flint. Sparks flew. On the third try, one caught in the tinder dry leaves. A tiny wisp of smoke appeared, then a small, hungry flame. The greasewood was rich with oil, and it caught fire with an audible whoosh. Thick, black, acrid smoke billowed upward, a greasy column rising into the twilight sky. It would create a screen, obscuring their path. More importantly, it would create a distraction, another piece of the puzzle to confuse and delay Barlow and his men. It was a signal fire that said here, drawing the hunter's eyes while the prey slipped away somewhere else entirely. Silas stamped out the edges of the small fire to keep it from spreading, then grabbed Eleanor's arm once more. "Now," he said, his voice urgent. "We move fast." He led her out of the canyon and into the gathering twilight, the column of black smoke rising behind them like a punctuation mark at the end of a violent and desperate chapter. They were alive, they were free, but they were in the heart of the wilderness, with hunters on their trail and a long, dark night ahead. And the silent man who had saved her was still a complete and terrifying mystery. The night that followed was a long, cold crucible, the desert, which had been an oven under the sun, transformed into a vast, refrigerated expanse under a sky of impossible clarity. The stars were not soft, friendly sparks, but hard, diamond chips scattered on black velvet, offering brilliance but no warmth. A sliver of a moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light that turned the landscape into a realm of silver and shadow, making every rock and cactus look like a crouching beast. They walked. There was no other choice. Silas set a relentless but sustainable pace, a steady, ground-eating stride that never seemed to falter. He no longer held Eleanor's arm, but he stayed close, a dark, silent shape moving just ahead of her, his broad shoulders a reassuring silhouette against the starlight. He navigated the treacherous terrain with an uncanny certainty, reading the contours of the land in the faint moonlight as if it were a familiar map. He led them through dry, sandy washes along the spines of low ridges to avoid the deeper, track-holding sand, and through groves of skeletal Joshua trees that clawed at the night sky. For Eleanor, the world had shrunk to the simple, agonizing task of placing one foot in front of the other. The initial adrenaline of their escape had long since burned away, leaving behind a profound and aching exhaustion. Her feet, bare and tender, were a mess of cuts and bruises from the rocks and thorns. Every step was a fresh jolt of pain. A deep, chilling cold seeped into her bones, a stark contrast to the fire that still burned in her scraped skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, the torn cotton of her dress offering no protection. She did not complain. She did not make a sound. Complaining felt like a luxury she had no right to. And besides, she had a sense that this silent, formidable man would have no patience for it. Her survival depended on her own fortitude, on her ability to keep up, to match his silence with her own stoic endurance. Twice, he stopped, not to rest, but to listen. He would freeze in place, his head cocked slightly, his entire being focused on the vast, whispering silence of the night. He was listening for the distant sound of horses, for the telltale clink of a shod hoof on stone, for any sign of pursuit. On both occasions, after a long, tense moment, he seemed satisfied and moved on. The unspoken message clear they were not yet safe. Eleanor learned to read these pauses, her own heart hammering in her chest until he began to walk again. She was learning his language, a dialect of movement and stillness, of watchfulness and action. The hours bled into one another, each one a small eternity of pain and cold. Her mind began to drift, her thoughts becoming a disconnected jumble of fear, memory, and sheer physical misery. She thought of the train, of the suffocating darkness under the coat, of the terrifying, tumbling fall, and she thought of the faces of the men, of Barlow's cold, possessive eyes. A shudder racked her body that had nothing to do with the cold. She stumbled, her ankle twisting, and fell to her knees with a soft cry of pain. Silas stopped instantly and turned. He was beside her in 2 strides, looming over her in the moonlight. She expected him to haul her to her feet, to growl a command to keep moving. Instead, he knelt on one knee in front of her. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and, with a surprising gentleness, took her right foot in his large, calloused hand. He examined the sole in the dim light, his thumb brushing away the sand to reveal the raw, bleeding cuts. He let go of her foot and stood up, shrugging off the heavy pack he'd been carrying on his back, a pack she hadn't even noticed until now. He rummaged inside it and produced a small tin and a strip of clean linen. He knelt again and, without asking permission, began to tend to her feet. He worked with an efficient, impersonal focus, first cleaning the cuts with a bit of cloth dampened from his canteen, then applying a pungent, greasy salve from the tin. The salve stung at first, then produced a blessed, numbing coolness. He wrapped both of her feet in the linen strips, his movements deft and sure. Finally, from the bottom of the pack, he pulled out a pair of thick wool socks. They were huge, clearly his own, but he slid them over her bandaged feet. They were a gift of impossible luxury, a cushion against the cruelty of the earth. He repacked his bag, stood up, and offered her a hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. "We're close," he said, his voice the same low rasp. It was only the 3rd time he had spoken to her. The words, spare as they were like a drink of water after a day of thirst. They gave her the strength to go on. They walked for another hour, and as they did, the landscape began to change. The ground sloped upward, and the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They were climbing into the foothills of a small, isolated mountain range that rose like a dark island from the sea of the desert. Just as the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern sky, they reached the crest of a high ridge. Silas stopped, and Eleanor came to a halt beside him, breathing in ragged gasps. Below them, Cradled in a deep, bowl-shaped depression lay a valley. It was like a secret world, hidden from the harsh reality of the desert that surrounded it. Even in the pale, pre-dawn light, she could see that it was green. A thin, silver ribbon of a creek snaked through its center, lined with the dark, lush foliage of cottonwood and willow trees. The valley floor was a patchwork of meadow grasses, dotted with wildflowers that were still closed against the night. The air tasted different here, clean, cool, and alive. It was a sanctuary, a place that the desolation of the outer world had not been allowed to touch. Nestled near the creek, under the shelter of a few ancient oak trees, was a ranch. It was not a grand place. A small, sturdy-looking cabin built of thick, weathered logs stood at its heart, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A welcome sign of life, a simple corral, its fences in need of mending, stood beside a low, sway-backed barn. A windmill creaked softly in the morning breeze, its blades turning with a rhythmic, soothing groan. It was a place that had been worked hard, a place that bore the scars of time and weather, but it was whole. It was a place of deep, abiding peace. Silas led her down a narrow, winding trail into the valley. As they descended, the world came alive with the sounds of the morning. A rooster crowed from the direction of the barn. Birds began to sing in the cottonwoods. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, spilling golden light across the valley floor, and Eleanor felt its warmth on her face like a benediction. The sheer, overwhelming relief of it was so powerful it made her knees weak. As they approached the cabin, the front door opened. A boy stood in the doorway, wiping sleep from his eyes. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a serious, watchful face. He was dressed in patched overalls and a simple shirt. He wasn't surprised to see Silas. He simply stood there, waiting. "Tom," Silas said. It was not a greeting, but a simple statement of fact. The boy, Tom, nodded. His solemn eyes flickered over to Eleanor, taking in her torn dress, her wild hair, and the enormous wool socks on her feet. There was curiosity in his gaze, but no fear or judgment. He had the same quiet, self-possessed stillness as the man beside her. "There's stew on the stove," Tom said, his voice quiet. He stepped back from the door, holding it open for them to enter. The inside of the cabin was one large room, spare but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Along the back wall were 2 neatly made bunks, a cast-iron stove, and shelves holding a few tin plates, a small sack of flour, and some dried beans. It was the home of men who owned little but took care of what they had. A simple door led to what she presumed was a small, second room. The air inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. It was the most welcoming scent she had ever known. Silas gestured toward the table. "Sit, eat." He ladled a thick, savory-smelling stew into a tin bowl and placed it in front of her, along with a hunk of dark bread. He did the same for himself and for Tom, and the 3 of them sat at the table in silence. Eleanor was so hungry that her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The stew was hot and rich, filled with meat and vegetables, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was the taste of safety. When she had finished, scraping the last of the stew from the bowl with her bread, a wave of exhaustion so profound it was like a physical blow washed over her. Her head grew heavy, her eyelids drooping. The warmth of the cabin, the food in her belly, and the release of 2 days of constant, gnawing terror conspired to shut down her body. Silas seemed to notice. He stood up and pushed open the door to the other room. "You can sleep in here," he said. She looked inside. It was a small, monastic space, containing nothing but a narrow bed with a simple mattress stuffed with straw and covered with clean, patched quilts. A small, unadorned wooden cross hung on the wall. A single window looked out onto the green of the valley. She stumbled into the room, her body moving on autopilot. She didn't even bother to pull back the quilts. She simply collapsed onto the bed, her face buried in the coarse, clean-smelling fabric. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the soft click of the door closing, shutting out the world and its dangers. She slept through the rest of the day and through the following night. It was a deep, dreamless, healing sleep, the kind that only comes when a body and soul are utterly spent. When she finally awoke, the sun was streaming through the small window, and the cabin was quiet. She sat up, her body stiff and sore, but the sharp edges of her pain and fear had been blunted. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she woke up without a knot of terror in her stomach. She saw that someone had left a pitcher of water and a clean, folded dress on a small crate beside the bed. The dress was simple homespun, faded but mended, infinitely better than the ruined rags she had been wearing. She washed her face in the cool water and put on the dress. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair, trying to bring some order to it. Then, hesitantly, she opened the door and stepped back into the main room. It was empty. Through the open front door, she could see Silas and Tom down by the corral, working together to replace a broken rail. They moved in a comfortable, practiced rhythm, Silas handling the heavy posts while Tom handed him tools. There was no need for words between them. A strange feeling began to bloom in Eleanor's chest. For so long, her existence had been about running, hiding, surviving. Here, there was only work, stillness, and the quiet rhythm of a day. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be a part of it, to do something useful, to anchor herself to this place with her own two hands. She saw the bowls from their meal the day before, still sitting on the table. She found a bucket and a bar of lye soap and carried them to the creek, where she scrubbed the bowls until they shone. When she brought them back, she saw a broom leaning against the wall and swept the cabin's wooden floors, the simple, repetitive motion a balm to her frayed nerves. She found a basket of mending and a needle and thread, and she sat on the cabin's front step in the warm sun, stitching a patch onto one of Tom's torn shirts. She worked all day, moving from one small task to the next. She fed the chickens, collected their eggs, and pulled weeds from a small vegetable garden behind the cabin. No one told her to do these things. No one asked her to. But with each task completed, she felt a small piece of herself knitting back together. She was not a victim here. She was not a runaway piece of property. She was a person who could sweep a floor and mend a shirt and pull a weed. It was a small, fragile foundation, but it was a beginning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, she stood on the porch, watching Silas and Tom lead the two horses they owned into the barn. The place was starting to feel familiar. Not the cabin itself, or the faces of the man and the boy, but the feeling, the deep, quiet peace of a day filled with simple, necessary work, the sense of being sheltered, of being in a place where the world's ugliness could not reach. It felt like coming home to a place she had never known she was missing, and for the first time in a very, very long time. Eleanor allowed herself to feel a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever hope. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as the slow turning of the windmill in the morning breeze. Life in the hidden valley was measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the movement of the sun across the sky and the simple, pressing needs of the day. There was water to be hauled from the creek, wood to be chopped for the stove, animals to be fed, and the constant small repairs that a life carved from the wilderness demanded. For Eleanor, who now answered to the softer, simpler name of Ellie, this rhythm was a lifeline. It was a routine so profound and absorbing that it left little room for the jagged-edged memories that had pursued her for so long. She rose with the first pale light, the same light that woke Tom in the other bunk, while Silas was already outside, tending to the horses. She and the boy would work in the comfortable silence of the cabin. She would rekindle the fire in the cook stove while Tom ground the coffee. The rich, earthy scent filling the small space. They would make a simple breakfast of oatmeal or fried cornmeal mush. And when Silas came in, his face still fresh from the cold morning air, they would eat together at the rough-hewn table. No one had assigned her these tasks. They had simply been there, waiting to be done. And she had taken them up as if she had been doing them her whole life. They were an anchor when her hands were busy kneading bread dough, or her focus was on the neat, even stitches of a patch on Tom's overalls. Her mind was blessedly quiet. The terror was still there, a sleeping beast in the deep woods of her memory, but here, in the gentle sunlight of the valley, it rarely stirred. She learned the contours of this new life through small, unspoken observations. She learned that Silas, for all his imposing size and profound silence, was a man of immense gentleness. She saw it in the way he handled his horses, his large hands stroking their necks, his voice a low, soothing murmur that she never heard him use with people. She saw it in the way he would leave a small, intricately carved wooden bird on Tom's pillow, a silent gift discovered in the morning. She saw that his silence was not one of anger or disapproval, but a deep, ingrained habit, the stillness of a man who had spent too much time alone in wide, empty spaces where words were a useless currency. She learned about Tom, too. He was as quiet as Silas, but his was a child's quietness, full of observation and a solemn wisdom that seemed beyond his years. He followed Silas everywhere, a small, devoted shadow, learning to read the land, to track game, to know which plants were medicine and which were poison. Ellie discovered that Tom had come to the valley 2 years earlier, a half-starved orphan Silas had found wandering near the ruins of a burned-out homestead. Silas had not taken him to a town or an orphanage. He had simply brought him home. He had given the boy a bed, a purpose, and the silent, unwavering protection of his presence. He had given Tom what he was now, however, temporarily, giving her a sanctuary. Several days had passed since their harrowing flight across the desert. The cuts on her feet had healed, covered by a pair of soft leather moccasins Tom had shyly given her. His own outgrown pair. Her skin, once pale, was taking on a healthy, sun-kissed hue. The frantic, haunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by a cautious calm. She was still a wild thing, poised to bolt at any sudden noise. But she was slowly, tentatively, beginning to trust the ground beneath her feet. The moment came on an evening like any other. The sun had dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in soft pastels of rose and lavender. Supper was over a simple meal of rabbit stew and fresh-baked bread. Tom was sitting on the floor by the hearth, carefully sharpening a knife under Silas's watchful eye. The quiet intimacy of the scene, the two of them working together in the warm glow of the firelight, was so potent, so achingly peaceful, that it hurt to look at. Ellie had taken the tin plates to a dry sink in the corner of the cabin, a simple wooden basin on a stand. She poured hot water from the kettle on the stove into the basin, the steam rising to mist her face. As she began to wash the dishes, the clink of the plates and the slosh of the warm, soapy water were the only sounds in the cabin besides the crackle of the fire. It was a mundane, domestic sound, a sound from a life she had never been allowed to have. And it was this simple, peaceful sound that finally unlocked the door she had kept so tightly barred. She wasn't aware of a conscious decision to speak. The words simply began to form, rising from a place of deep, sorrowful pressure within her. Her voice, when it came, was so low it was almost part of the evening's quiet. "My father," she began, her eyes fixed on her hands in the murky water. "He was a merchant in St. Louis." At the hearth, Tom's small hands stilled. Silas, who had been inspecting the boy's work, lifted his head. His gaze, shadowed and unreadable, settled on her back. He did not speak, but the quality of his stillness changed. It was no longer passive. It was focused, attentive. "He didn't trade in cotton or tobacco," Ellie continued, her voice gaining a slight, tremulous strength. He traded in appearances, in connections. He wanted a bigger house, a seat on the town council, the respect of men he considered his betters. He saw everything as a transaction, a means to an end. She scrubbed at a plate with a ferocity that was not required, her knuckles white. I was his daughter, but I was also an asset. My mother died when I was young, and he raised me to be presentable, to play the pianoforte, to pour tea without spilling, to smile and say nothing of consequence. He was preparing me for market. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek and fell, hissing, into the dishwater. She didn't seem to notice. When I was 17, he made a very profitable trade. He introduced me to a man named Mr. Barlow. At the name, she felt a subtle shift in the room behind her. Silas's attention, which had been a focused beam, now felt as sharp and hard as a shard of obsidian. "He wasn't from St. Louis," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He was from out here, from the territories. He had money, a great deal of it, from liquor and freight contracts with the army. He was older than my father. He had a reputation, but my father saw only the money and the influence that came with it. He called it a brilliant match, a secure future for me." She stopped, her hands frozen in the water. The memory was so vivid she could smell the stale cigar smoke that had clung to Barlow's expensive coat, feel the damp, possessive grip of his hand on her arm. "He was not a kind man," she said, the understatement a testament to the poverty of her vocabulary when it came to describing his particular brand of cruelty. "He liked things, fine things. He liked his house to be in order, his horses to be well groomed, his wife to be silent and decorative. I was just another of his possessions, the most valuable one. He liked to say. He would show me off at parties, his hand always on my waist, a smile on his face that never, ever reached his cold eyes." She took a ragged breath, the confession pouring out of her now, a torrent of poison that had been held back for too long. "The first time he was displeased with me, it was because I had spoken to a young army lieutenant for too long. His displeasure, it was not loud. It was quiet. He waited until everyone was gone. He didn't use his fists. He used his words. He told me, in precise detail, everything I was. Worthless. Stupid. An ungrateful creature that he had purchased at a high price and could dispose of just as easily. He said that my father had known exactly what kind of man he was, that he had sold me, knowing the weight of that final, terrible knowledge. The confirmation of her father's ultimate betrayal had been the thing that had finally broken her spirit. I lived in his house for a year, a beautiful house, a prison. I learned to be invisible, to anticipate his moods, to speak only when spoken to be the perfect, silent wife he had paid for. But there was a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that would not die, and the more he tried to crush it, the stronger it grew. A month ago, he made a new deal, a business arrangement. He offered me to his new partner as a sign of his hospitality for the night. She stopped, choking on the words. She could not say more. The shame and the horror were suffocating. The silence in the cabin was absolute, profound. Even the fire seemed to crackle more softly. "I ran," she whispered. "That night, I climbed out a window with nothing. I just ran. I stole a ride on a farmer's wagon. I begged for scraps of food. I was trying to get to California, or anywhere he wouldn't think to look. I thought, if I could just get on that train. But his men were everywhere. Hank and Dusty, they found me in Santa Fe. I saw them at the station. That's when I ran onto the last car." She finally turned from the sink, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with the memory of her desperation. She looked at Silas, this huge, silent man who had inexplicably saved her. "I didn't expect anyone to help me," she said, her voice raw with a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. "The world, it isn't a kind place. Men are either buying or selling. That's all I've ever known. When I asked to hide under your coat, I expected you to laugh, or to turn me away, or to ask for payment." Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. "I didn't expect you to just lift it up." She stood there, trembling, completely exposed. Her story, her shame, her fear, it was all laid bare on the floor of this quiet cabin. She had given them the weapon that could destroy her. Tom was staring at her, his young face a mixture of confusion and a solemn, child's empathy. He looked from her to Silas, as if seeking an explanation, a cue for how to react to this terrible adult sorrow. Silas did not move for a long moment. He simply held her gaze from across the room. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask carved from weathered wood. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. He walked toward her, his heavy boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the floorboards. She flinched, a small, involuntary recoil, a lifetime of conditioning telling her that a man approaching in anger was a prelude to pain. He didn't stop until he was standing right beside her at the wash basin. He didn't speak. He didn't offer words of comfort or of judgment. He simply reached over, picked up a clean, dry cloth from the small stack she had set aside, and took the wet plate from her nerveless fingers. He began to dry it, his large hands surprisingly careful with the fragile tin. He took the next plate she washed, and the next. They worked in silence. The only sounds, the gentle splash of water and the soft scrape of the cloth against metal. It was a simple, domestic act, an offer of help in a small, mundane task. But in the charged silence of the room, it was everything. It was an acceptance. It was a sharing of the burden. He was not pitying her. He was standing with her. When the last dish was dried and stacked, she stood with her hands gripping the edge of the wooden basin, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had held herself together for so long. And now, in the face of this small, unexpected kindness, her defenses had crumbled. She felt a weight, firm and warm, on her shoulder. She looked up and saw Silas's hand resting there. It was not a lover's caress. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a touch of solid, grounding reassurance. It was a silent statement, as clear as if he had shouted it from the mountaintops. "I have heard you. You are not alone. You are safe here." She leaned into the touch, just for a second, and drew a deep, shuddering breath. For the first time, it did not feel like the breath of a hunted animal, but of a woman who had finally, impossibly, found a place to rest. The morning after her confession, the light in the valley seemed different. It was softer, clearer, as if the telling of her story had washed the air clean. The silence in the cabin was different, too. It was no longer just the absence of a noise, but a space that was now filled with a new and fragile understanding. When Ellie met Silas's eyes across the breakfast table, he gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a simple acknowledgement, a silent affirmation that nothing had been broken by her words. In fact, something had been built. A bridge had been erected across the chasm of their silence, and now they could begin to cross it, one tentative step at a time. A weight she hadn't even been fully aware of carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. She moved with a new lightness, a sense of purpose that went beyond the simple need to make herself useful. The chores were no longer an anchor in a storm. They were the quiet, rhythmic work of building a new life. When she fed the chickens, she found herself humming a half-forgotten tune. When she tended the small garden, she took pleasure in the feel of the cool, dark earth on her hands. The sleeping beast of her fear was still there, but its lair seemed much farther away now. Its growl faded to a distant echo. The valley itself began to reveal its secrets to her, emboldened by the sense of safety that now enveloped her. She started taking short walks in the late afternoon. After the day's main work was done, she would follow the winding path of the creek, her bare feet enjoying the cool mud at its edge. She learned the names of the birds by their songs, the way Tom had quietly taught her the cheerful warble of the meadowlark, the trilling call of the canyon wren. She discovered patches of wild mint and thyme, crushing their leaves in her fingers and breathing in their sharp, clean scents. It was on one of these walks, in a place where the valley walls grew steep and rocky, that she saw it. Growing from a thin fissure in a large, sun-warmed slab of granite was a single, defiant wildflower. It was an Indian paintbrush, its fiery, scarlet bracts a startling slash of color against the dull gray of the rock. It was a small, impossible thing, thriving where nothing else ought to grow. It was beautiful. But more than that, it was resilient. It was a survivor. She stood looking at it for a long time, a strange and powerful emotion swelling in her chest. The flower felt like a symbol of her own nascent hope, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding nature of life. On impulse, she reached out and carefully plucked it from its rocky perch, its stem thin and surprisingly strong. She held it in her hand all the way back to the cabin, its vibrant color a secret joy. She didn't know what to do with it. Giving it to Silas directly felt too bold, too forward. It was a gesture for which she had no words, and she knew he was a man who had even fewer, so she did the only thing she could think of. When she reached the cabin, she laid the single, perfect flower on the edge of the porch, on the top step that he used every morning and every evening. It was a silent offering, a small splash of color left in the path of a silent man. She did not know if he would even notice it, or if he did, what he would make of it. She went inside, her heart beating a little faster than usual, and did not look back. The next morning, the flower was gone. Ellie felt a small, sharp pang of disappointment. She told herself it was foolish. He had probably seen it as a bit of stray vegetation and swept it off the step without a second thought. It was a silly, sentimental gesture, and he was a practical man. Life went on. She rekindled the fire, made the coffee, and tried to put it from her mind. Later that day, however, something happened. Silas was sitting at the table, mending a piece of leather harness that had split. Beside him lay a small, worn, leather-bound notebook and a pencil stub. She had seen this notebook before. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit and make notes or sketches in it, maps of the valley, perhaps, or lists of supplies. His focus was entirely on his work, his large hands surprisingly nimble as he threaded a thick needle through the tough leather. Tom was outside, and the cabin was quiet. Ellie was folding a pile of mended laundry. As she turned from the table, her elbow accidentally brushed against the notebook, knocking it from the table. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, falling open. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she gasped, bending down to retrieve it. "It's nothing," Silas rumbled, not looking up from his work. As she picked it up, her eyes fell upon the open page. It was not a map or a list. It was a detailed, exquisitely rendered sketch of a bird, a canyon wren, its tiny head cocked, its beak open in song. He had captured its lively spirit with just a few spare, confident lines. She had never suspected this hidden dimension to him, this artist's eye that saw and recorded the small beauties of their world. But it was what lay on the facing page that made her breath catch in her throat. There, carefully pressed between the pages, its color still vibrant, was her wildflower. He had not swept it away. He had not discarded it. He had saved it. He had taken her small, silent offering and placed it among the things he deemed worthy of keeping. He had pressed it into the pages of his private world, preserving it as carefully as he had sketched the wren. He had understood. Her heart flooded with a warmth so intense it almost made her dizzy. She closed the notebook gently, her fingers trembling slightly, and placed it back on the table. He still did not look up from his work, but she felt the moment pass between them, as tangible as a spoken word. It was the most eloquent thank you she had ever received. After that day, the silent conversation between them deepened. It was a language composed entirely of small, considerate actions. a dialogue of deeds, not words. Ellie discovered a place she loved to rest during the hottest part of the day, a small, grassy hollow shaded by a large cottonwood tree near the creek. It was a cool, quiet spot where she could watch the water flow and listen to the rustle of the leaves. She would go there after the midday meal, sitting with her back against the thick trunk, and feel the tension of the world drain away. A few days after the incident with the flower, she arrived at her spot to find a tin cup resting on a flat stone at the base of the tree. The cup was filled with water, so cold it was beaded with condensation. It was water from the deep, rock-sheltered spring behind the cabin, far cooler and sweeter than the water in the creek. He had noticed her daily pilgrimage. He had seen where she went to find her peace, and he had taken the time to walk to the spring, fill a cup, and bring it here for her, anticipating her need. It became a daily ritual. Every day, the cup of cold water would be there, waiting for her. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him for it. There was no need. The gesture was the message, and it spoke of a watchfulness, a quiet, protective care that wrapped around her more surely than any blanket. Their shared work became another verse in this unspoken poem. The main gate to the horse corral had been sagging for some time, its post rotted at the base, its iron hinge rusted and bent. It was a heavy, unwieldy thing that took 2 men to lift. One morning, Silas and Tom set about to fix it. Silas dug out the old post, his powerful shoulders straining as he levered the heavy, waterlogged wood from the earth. Tom, his face a mask of serious concentration, cleared the dirt from the hole and stood ready with the tools. Ellie watched them from the cabin for a few minutes. In her old life, she would have been expected to stay inside, to remain in the domestic sphere, separate from the world of men's work. But this was not her old life. She walked out into the bright morning sun, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth. Silas looked up as she approached, a question in his eyes. She did not say, "Can I help?" She simply walked over to the new post, a solid length of juniper he had cut and seasoned that lay on the ground. She knew she was not strong enough to lift it, but she could help guide it. "I can hold it steady once you have it in the hole," she said, her voice clear and direct. Silas looked at her for a moment, then gave another of his small, decisive nods. Together, the 3 of them became a surprisingly efficient team. Silas provided the brute strength, lifting the heavy post and setting it into the deep hole. Ellie and Tom worked on either side, using smaller rocks and wedges of wood to brace it, ensuring it was perfectly upright. Ellie followed Silas's silent cues, a glance, a slight tilt of his head passing him the maul when he needed it, holding the level steady against the wood. Their hands brushed as she passed him a tool. His skin was rough and calloused against hers, and a jolt, as clean and surprising as a spark of static electricity, passed between them. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing, but he seemed not to notice, his focus entirely on the task. They worked through the morning, a slow, laborious process of setting the post, mixing mud and stone to pack it in, and then rehanging the heavy gate on new, oiled hinges. When it was finally done, Silas stepped back. He gave the gate a push. It swung open smoothly, silently, and then swung shut with a satisfying and solid thump. A rare, small smile touched the corners of Silas's mouth. He looked at Tom, who was beaming with a child's pure pride in a job well done. Then his eyes met Ellie's, and in that shared glance over the solid, well-hung gate that they had fixed together, a powerful connection was forged. They had not just mended a piece of the ranch, they had built something between them, a small piece of a shared life, grounded in mutual effort and quiet respect. That evening, as Ellie sat on the porch step, the same step where she had once left a flower, she looked out at the valley turning purple in the twilight. She was no longer just a refugee here, a person being sheltered from a storm. She was becoming a part of the place, her presence woven into its daily fabric. The language she was learning with Silas was the most honest language she had ever known. It was a language free of lies and flattery, of hidden motives and cruel deceptions. It was a language of pressed flowers and cool water, of mended gates and patched shirts. It was the language of trust, being planted in the quiet, fertile soil of the valley, and she could feel its roots, fine and strong, beginning to take hold in her heart. The weeks that followed were a quiet gift of stolen time. A fragile peace settled over the valley, as gentle and pervasive as the morning mist that rose from the creek. For Ellie, it was a time of healing, not just of the body, but of the soul. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long had receded, replaced by the simple, grounding rhythms of the ranch. She was no longer a hunted animal, but a person rediscovering the forgotten contours of her own self. The silence between her and Silas was no longer empty. It was a comfortable, shared space, rich with an unspoken language of mutual respect and burgeoning affection. Life had taken on a predictable and reassuring pattern. Mornings were for chores, afternoons for the quiet work of mending or tending the garden, and evenings were spent in the warm, fire-lit cabin. Tom, who had at first been a solemn and distant observer, had slowly accepted her into his small world. He would bring her things a perfectly shaped river stone, a hawk's feather, the first wild raspberry of the season, and leave them for her as silent offerings, much as Silas had once done. She, in turn, would read to him from the one book the cabin possessed, a worn copy of Shakespeare, her voice soft in the flickering light as Tom listened, rapt, to tales of kings and faraway lands he could barely imagine. It was in these small, quiet moments that the real transformation occurred. The three of them, a silent man, a frightened boy, and a broken woman, had slowly, unconsciously, begun to knit themselves into the shape of a family. The illusion of safety was so complete, so all-encompassing, that the first sign of its shattering went almost unnoticed. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low and turning the valley a burnished gold. A profound and unnatural quiet fell. The cheerful chirping of the crickets ceased. The birds in the cottonwoods fell silent. In the corral, one of the horses tossed its head and gave a low, nervous whicker, its ears swiveling toward the high ridge at the valley's entrance. Silas was sharpening an axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 a familiar and soothing sound. He stopped mid-stroke. His head came up, his body instantly alert, his stillness no longer peaceful but coiled, predatory. Ellie, who was on the porch mending one of Tom's shirts, felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. She had seen that look on his face only once before, in the train car, moments before their world had exploded. "Ellie," Silas said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Take Tom, get in the cabin, bar the door." He didn't need to say anything else. She dropped her sewing and scrambled to her feet, grabbing Tom's small hand. The boy looked up at Silas, his eyes wide with a fear that reflected her own. "Go," Silas ordered, his voice sharper now. He was already moving toward the barn, his steps long and purposeful. Ellie pulled Tom into the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slammed the heavy wooden door and dropped the thick iron bar into its brackets. It felt like a pitifully inadequate defense. She ran to the small window, her breath catching in her throat. At the top of the ridge, 3 figures on horseback had appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun. They were not neighbors. They were not lost travelers. Even at this distance, their predatory stillness was unmistakable. It was Barlow and his men. The peace was over. The outside world, with all its ugliness and cruelty, had found them. Silas emerged from the barn, a long Winchester rifle in his hands. He didn't run or take cover. He stood in the middle of the yard, a solitary, defiant figure, his legs planted wide, the rifle held loosely at his side. He was a mountain, daring the storm to break against him. Barlow's voice drifted down into the valley, amplified by the strange, still air. It was a voice of mocking civility, a sound more chilling than any shout. Silas Boone, I should have known I'd find you in a place like this. You always did have a taste for hiding away. The three men began to ride slowly down the trail into the valley. They were not in a hurry. They were savoring the moment, the certainty of their victory. "I've come for what's mine." "Boone," Barlow called out. "My wife. Send her out, and we can conclude our business without any unnecessary mess." Silas raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the movement fluid and economical. He didn't answer with words. He answered with a single, deafening shot. A puff of dust exploded in the dirt just in front of Barlow's horse. The animal reared, screaming in terror. It was a warning shot, a clear and unambiguous statement. Barlow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the valley walls. Have it your way. Then, the idyllic valley floor erupted into a battlefield. Barlow and Dusty spurred their horses toward the cover of the trees lining the creek, while Hank, the burly one, dismounted and took cover behind a rocky outcrop, his own rifle barking in response. A bullet splintered the wood of the cabin door, inches from where Ellie was standing. She screamed and threw herself to the floor, pulling Tom down with her. Outside, Silas had become a creature of pure, violent motion. He fired, levered a new round into the chamber, and fired again, all in a seamless rhythm. He was no longer a quiet rancher. He was a warrior, his face a grim mask of concentration. He moved from the cover of the barn to the corner of the corral, never staying in one place for long, making himself a difficult target. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the whine of ricochets, and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. From her place on the floor, Ellie could only listen, her mind a maelstrom of terror. Every gunshot was a fresh wave of panic. Tom was huddled beside her, his small body trembling, his face buried in her side. She held him tight, whispering reassurances she did not feel, her own fear a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. The gunfight raged for what felt like an eternity. Silas was a formidable opponent, his marksmanship deadly, his knowledge of the terrain giving him an advantage. He pinned the three men down, forcing them to stay behind cover. But he was one man against three. The odds were impossible. Barlow, ever the strategist, changed tactics. While Hank and Dusty laid down a covering fire, he dismounted and crept through the thick brush along the creek, circling around toward the barn. Ellie saw a flicker of movement through the window, and her blood ran cold. He was going to flank Silas. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice lost in the din of the gunfire. "Behind you, in the barn!" Silas must have heard her, or perhaps his own instincts warned him. He turned, bringing the Winchester around just as Barlow burst from the side of the barn, a pistol in his hand. Both men fired at the same time. Silas cried out, stumbling back, a dark stain blossoming on his left shoulder. But his own shot had found its mark. Barlow's pistol flew from his hand, and he staggered back, clutching a wrist that was now a mangled ruin of blood and bone. Seeing their leader hit, Hank and Dusty broke from cover, charging forward with enraged shouts. The fight was no longer a calculated exchange of gunfire. It had devolved into a brutal, close-quarters brawl. Silas, wounded and bleeding, met their charge head-on. He swung the heavy Winchester like a club, catching Hank in the chest and sending him sprawling. He turned to face Dusty, a giant of a man, and the two of them crashed together in a desperate, grunting struggle. Silas was bigger, stronger. He fought with the ferocious, desperate power of a man defending his home, his family. He drove his fist into Dusty's face, then another. The man reeled back, stunned, but the wound in Silas's shoulder was taking its toll. His movements were becoming slower, his breathing labored. And Barlow was not out of the fight. His face contorted with pain and fury. He scooped up a heavy piece of firewood from the pile beside the cabin. While Silas was locked in combat with Dusty, Barlow crept up behind him, his movements silent and serpentine. He raised the log high over his head. "Silas!" "No!" Ellie shrieked from the window, but it was too late. The heavy wood came down with a sickening final thud against the back of Silas's skull. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a felled tree, face down in the dirt. He did not move. A terrible, ringing silence fell over the yard, broken only by the ragged, panting breaths of the victorious men. Ellie stared in horror, her mind refusing to accept what she had just seen. Silas, her protector, her silent rock, was down. They were alone. Barlow, cradling his shattered wrist, kicked Silas's still form with his boot. Fool! He spat. He looked toward the cabin, his eyes burning with a triumphant, possessive fire. Now, let's collect my property. The heavy bar on the door was kicked from its brackets with a single, violent blow, and the door flew open. Hank and Dusty stormed in, their faces bruised and beaded with sweat. Ellie scrambled backward, pulling Tom with her, until her back was against the cold stone of the hearth. There you are. My dear, Barlow said, stepping into the cabin. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes were alight with a cruel victory. Did you really think you could run from me? Did you really think this farmer could protect you? He took a step toward her. Tom, in a sudden, incredible act of courage, pushed himself in front of Ellie, his small body a defiant shield. Leave her alone, he yelled, his child's voice high and trembling. Hank laughed, a brutish, ugly sound. He reached down and snatched the boy up by the front of his overalls, lifting him clear off the ground. Tom Ellie screamed. Look at this, Hank sneered. Another little stray. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt and pressed its cold, flat side against Tom's cheek. You should have stayed hidden, boy. He moved the blade until its sharp edge rested against the soft skin of Tom's throat. Time stopped. Ellie's world narrowed to the glint of steel against Tom's neck, to the boy's wide, terrified eyes, to the cruel smirk on Hank's face, a primal, instinctual rage, hotter and more powerful than any fear she had ever known, erupted inside her. This was not about her anymore. They were going to hurt this child, this innocent boy who was the living embodiment of all the goodness and hope she had found in this valley. Her eyes darted around the room, searching, desperate, and then she saw it, propped against the wall, next to the fireplace where Silas always kept it, was his spare pistol, a heavy Colt revolver. She moved without thinking. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a runaway. She was a protector. She lunged for the gun, her fingers closing around its cold, heavy grip. It was heavier than she could have imagined. Put the boy down, she said, her voice a low, shaking growl she did not recognize as her own. The three men turned to look at her. Barlow's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in contempt. Don't be a fool. Eleanor, you don't even know how to hold that. She raised the heavy gun with both hands, trying to steady its wavering barrel. Her arms trembled from the weight. Her heart was a frantic, wild thing, threatening to burst from her chest. She centered the sight on Hank's broad, sneering face. I said. She repeated, her voice gaining a sharp, dangerous edge. Let him go. Hank's smirk faltered. He saw the look in her eyes. This was not the timid, frightened girl he remembered. This was someone else. Do it, Hank, Barlow ordered, a new urgency in his voice. Finish the boy and let's be done with this. Hank tightened his grip on Tom, the knife pressing ever so slightly deeper. That was all it took. Ellie's fear and rage and desperation coalesced into a single, decisive point. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the confines of the small cabin. The gun kicked back violently, almost tearing itself from her grasp. Acrid smoke filled the air. She hadn't aimed. She had just pointed and fired. The bullet went wide of Hank's head, burying itself in the log wall behind him with a loud thwack. But it was enough. The sheer, unexpected violence of the act stunned them all into a moment of frozen shock. And in that moment, a new sound entered the equation. It was the terrifying, unmistakable double-click of a shotgun's hammers being cocked. "I'd recommend the three of you drop your weapons. Now." The voice came from the open doorway. It was old and gravelly, like stones grinding together. Standing there was a man who looked as old and weathered as the mountains themselves. He was gaunt and stooped, with a wild mane of white hair and a beard that reached his chest. But the double-barreled shotgun he held was as steady as a rock. Its twin muzzles pointed squarely at Barlow's chest. Barlow stared at the old man. "Raoul, what in God's name are you doing here?" "Heard the commotion from my claim up the ridge." The old man, Raoul, rasped. "Sounded like you boys were having a party. Didn't figure Silas would appreciate you inviting yourselves." Hank, still holding Tom, hesitated. The shotgun did not waver. Ellie, her ears still ringing, raised the heavy pistol again, this time pointing it at Hank. They were caught between two guns. "Let the boy go." "Hank," Barlow said, his voice cold and clipped. He recognized a losing hand when he saw one. This was no longer an easy retrieval. It was a fight they might not win. Hank shoved Tom away. The boy stumbled and fell into Ellie's arms. She held him tight, her body still shaking uncontrollably. "This ain't over." "Boone!" Barlow snarled at Silas's unconscious form on the ground. Then he turned his venomous gaze on Ellie. "And it's not over for you. There's nowhere you can run where I won't find you." He backed slowly out of the cabin, his one good hand held up in the air. Dusty and Hank followed, their faces a mixture of fury and disbelief. They collected the reins of their horses, mounted up, and spurred them back up the trail, disappearing over the ridge as quickly as they had come. They were gone. The sudden silence was as loud as the gunfire had been. Ellie sank to the floor, pulling Tom into her lap, her strength completely gone. The heavy Colt fell from her numb fingers and clattered onto the floorboards. Raoul lowered the shotgun, a weary sigh escaping his lips. The immediate danger had passed, but the valley's peace was in ashes. And Silas, the man who was its heart and its guardian, lay still and bleeding in the dirt. The life he had fought so hard to protect now hanging by the most fragile of threads. The world rushed back in a torrent of sound and sensation. The sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder in the air. The feel of Tom's small, trembling body in her arms. The sight of Silas so terribly still, lying in the dirt yard. For a heart-stopping moment, Ellie's mind went blank, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming horror of it all. They were alive, they were safe, but at what cost? It was Raoul's gravelly voice that broke the spell. "Girl, there'll be time for shaking later. Right now, this man needs us." His words were a splash of icy water, shocking her out of her stupor. He was right. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. She looked at Silas again, not as a fallen protector, but as a man desperately in need of care, a fierce, protective instinct, the same one that had made her pick up the gun, surged through her again, overriding her fear. This man had saved her life, had given her a sanctuary. She would not let him die in the dust. "Tom," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "go to the creek and bring back a bucket of the coldest water you can find, and the cleanest rags from the cabin, quickly now." The boy, his face pale and tear-streaked, looked from her to Raoul and then back again. Seeing the new, unwavering resolve in her eyes, he nodded and scrambled to his feet, running toward the creek with a child's desperate urgency. Raoul knelt beside Silas, his old, gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as he felt for a pulse at Silas's neck. He let out a slow, relieved breath. He's alive. Heart's beating steady enough, but this head wound, it's a bad one. Together, they carefully rolled Silas over. The back of his head was matted with blood, and the gunshot wound in his shoulder was weeping a dark, steady crimson into the fabric of his shirt. He was a dead weight, an immense and helpless burden. "We have to get him inside," Ellie said, her mind racing. It was a monumental task. Raoul was wiry but old, his strength long since faded. Ellie, though filled with a desperate energy, was no match for Silas's sheer size and weight. When Tom returned with the water, the three of them, the old prospector, the determined woman, and the solemn boy, struggled together. They half lifted, half dragged him, their feet slipping in the dirt, their breaths coming in ragged, painful gasps. Every inch was a victory. They finally managed to get him through the cabin door and onto his own bunk, his long legs hanging over the end. He lay there, utterly still, his breathing shallow, a fallen giant in his own home. And so the vigil began. The days that followed blurred into a single, unending twilight of fear and hope, measured only by the changing of bandages and the slow dripping of water from a cloth onto Silas's parched lips. The cabin, once a place of quiet peace, became a sick room, filled with the hushed sounds of care and the heavy silence of waiting. Raoul, it turned out, was a man of surprising knowledge. He had spent a lifetime in the wilderness, and his hands, though gnarled with age, knew the arts of mending broken bodies. He cleaned the gunshot wound with whiskey from a flask he carried, a harsh remedy that made Silas's unconscious form flinch. He probed the wound with a knife sterilized in the fire and, with a grimace, extracted the lead slug, a flattened, ugly piece of metal. Ellie, her stomach churning, held the lamp steady, her own fear pushed down by the need to be useful. Bullet went clean through the muscle. Raoul grunted, his voice a low reassurance. Missed the bone? He's lucky. Now, you got a needle and a strong thread. While Raoul stitched the wound with a crude but effective skill, Ellie tended to the more dangerous injury. She gently washed the blood from Silas's hair, revealing a long, deep gash at the back of his head where Barlow's log had struck. The skin was broken, the skull beneath bruised and swollen. There was nothing to be done for this wound but to keep it clean, to pray, and to wait. Time became a fluid, meaningless thing. Ellie did not sleep. Not really. She dozed in a chair pulled up beside the bunk, her body slumping with exhaustion, but her senses remained on a knife's edge. Attuned to every breath Silas took, she learned the rhythm of his breathing, the shallow, almost imperceptible inhalations, the soft, fluttering exhales. Any change, any hitch or shudder in that rhythm sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She cared for him with a devotion that was both tender and desperate. She bathed his face with cool water, her touch as gentle as a whisper. She forced thin broth, spoonful by spoonful, between his unresponsive lips, praying that some of it would find its way down his throat. She talked to him, her voice a constant, low murmur in the quiet cabin. She told him about her day, about how Tom had managed to fix a loose floorboard, about the hawk she had seen circling high above the valley. She told him he was strong, that he had to fight, that he had to come back. She did not know if he could hear her, but she could not bear the silence. Tom became her small, solemn assistant. He would sit with her for hours, his presence a quiet comfort. He would fetch fresh water, hold the bowl for her, and watch her with his serious, knowing eyes. He seemed to understand, in a way that only a child who has already known great loss can, the fragility of the life that lay in the balance. One afternoon, he came inside and silently placed one of the small, carved wooden birds Silas had made for him into Silas's limp hand, closing the man's large, unresponsive fingers around the familiar shape. It was a child's offering, an act of pure, desperate faith. Raoul stayed for 2 days, his presence a gruff, grounding force. He showed her how to grind willow bark into a powder to make a tea to fight the fever that had begun to consume Silas. He taught her how to recognize the signs of infection, how to change the dressings without causing more harm. On the 3rd morning, he stood at the door, his shotgun in hand. "I gotta get back to my claim," he said, not looking at her, "but I'll check in on you every day. You holler if you need anything." He paused, his gaze shifting to the still figure on the bunk. "He's a good man. Silas, tough as a boiled owl. If anyone can pull through this, it's him. Then he was gone, leaving Ellie and Tom alone with their patient. The responsibility settled on her shoulders with an almost physical weight. But it was not a crushing weight. It was a clarifying one. Her purpose had never been so simple, or so absolute she had to keep this man alive. The fever was the worst part. It came on the third night, a dry, consuming heat that radiated from his skin. He began to thrash in his bunk, his powerful limbs moving with a strength that terrified her. He muttered unintelligible words, his mind lost in a dark, fevered dream. Ellie and Tom had to work together to hold him down, to keep him from tearing out Raoul's careful stitches. She spent the entire night bathing his body with cool cloths, her own clothes soaked with sweat and water, her arms aching with fatigue. She was fighting a battle against an invisible enemy, a fire that was trying to burn him up from the inside. In those long, desperate hours, she found herself praying. She prayed to a God she had long since abandoned, a God who had stood by while her life was sold and her spirit was broken. But her prayers were not for herself. They were for him. They were fierce, desperate bargains whispered into the darkness. "Let him live," she pleaded, "and I will ask for nothing else. Just let him live." By the fifth day, she was hollowed out, a ghost moving through the motions of care. She had barely eaten, had barely slept. She was running on a fuel of pure, stubborn will. The fever had not broken, and a terrible, creeping despair had begun to take root in her heart. She sat by his bed, holding a cool cloth to his forehead, and watched the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was so still, so pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. She was losing him. The thought was a physical blow, an agony so sharp it stole her breath. She had run from a life of fear, only to find a new and more terrible fear, the fear of losing this quiet, impossible peace, the fear of losing the one person in the world who had shown her a kindness that asked for nothing in return. She must have dozed off, her head falling forward onto her chest. She was woken by a sound. It was not a fevered mumble or a pained groan. It was a soft, scratching sound. Her head snapped up. Silas's eyes were open. They were not the wild, unfocused eyes of a man lost in delirium. They were hazy, clouded with pain and confusion. But they were open, and they were looking at her. For a moment, she could not breathe. She could only stare, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. His lips were cracked and dry. He tried to speak, but only a faint, rasping sound came out. He lifted his right hand, the one not encumbered by the wounded shoulder. It was a slow, incredibly weak movement. His hand trembled with the effort, but he lifted it from the quilt and moved it toward her. Ellie's own hand shot out to meet his. She enclosed his large, calloused hand in both of her own. His skin was still hot, but the raging fire of the fever seemed to have banked. His fingers were weak, but they made a faint, conscious effort to close around hers. She stared at his face, her vision blurring with tears. She saw his eyes slowly tracking her features, as if he were relearning the shape of her face, and she saw the change. The look in his eyes was different from any she had seen before. Gone was the guarded, unreadable stillness, the impassive mask of a man who kept the world at a distance. In its place was something new. It was a look of raw, unguarded recognition. It was the look of a man who had journeyed to the edge of a great darkness and had found a familiar light waiting for him when he returned. In his eyes, she saw not just acknowledgement, but a deep, weary gratitude that was more eloquent than any words could ever be. He had seen her, not just as a woman he had rescued, but as the person who had sat by his side, who had fought for him, who had refused to let him go. The tears she had held back for so long finally spilled over, tracing hot paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or of fear, but of a relief so profound it felt like a physical release, a breaking of a great tension within her soul. She lowered her head until her forehead rested on their joined hands, and she wept. She felt a faint pressure on her hand, a weak but insistent squeeze from his fingers. She looked up. meeting his gaze through her tears. The simple, solid reality of his touch, the feeling of his life flowing back into his hand, was the most powerful reassurance in the world. She leaned closer, her voice a raw, trembling whisper that was meant for him alone. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "The words a confession, a vow, a prayer of thanks. I haven't been afraid. Not since I met you." He did not speak. He did not have the strength, but a flicker of understanding, of a deep and resonant emotion, passed through his eyes. He held her hand, and in that simple, profound connection, in the quiet of the small cabin, with the golden afternoon light streaming through the window, a life that had been nearly lost was found, and a love that had been unspoken was finally, irrevocably, acknowledged. The awakening was not an end to the vigil, but the beginning of a new one. Silas was back among them, but he was a shadow of the man he had been. The long days of fever and unconsciousness had stripped him of his formidable strength, leaving him weak, hollow-eyed, and bound to the confines of his bunk, for a man whose entire existence was defined by action and physical competence. The imprisonment of his own body was a quiet and profound form of torture. In those first days of his consciousness, a new routine settled upon the small cabin, one dictated by the slow, arduous process of healing. Ellie's role shifted from a desperate guardian of life to a gentle, patient nurse. The frantic energy that had sustained her through the crisis was replaced by a calm, steady tenderness. She was his anchor to the world, the constant presence he saw when his eyes fluttered open, the provider of his every need. She would help him sit up, his powerful frame now surprisingly frail, his head lolling with dizziness from the injury. She would spoon broth and, later, soft porridge into his mouth, ignoring his initial, frustrated attempts to feed himself, his hands trembling too much to hold a spoon. He was a man accustomed to giving aid, not receiving it, and the humility of his position was a heavy cloak. His frustration would sometimes simmer in the tense set of his jaw or the stormy look in his eyes, but Ellie met it with an unshakable calm. She would simply place her hand on his forearm, a silent gesture that said, "Let me, it's my turn to be strong," and he, with a weary sigh, would relent. His silence, once a fortress, was now a necessity. Speaking was an effort that exhausted him, and so they continued their conversation in the language of actions they had begun to build before the attack. A slight nod from him was a request for water. A faint, questioning look was a query about Tom. Her hand, placed gently on his forehead, was both a check for fever and a gesture of pure, unadorned affection. Raoul's daily visits were a lifeline. The old prospector would bring herbs for a healing poultice and, occasionally, a rabbit or a brace of quail for the pot. He would sit with Silas while Ellie worked outside, the two old friends sharing a comfortable silence that stretched back years. Raoul's presence was a gruff reassurance, a connection to the world beyond the sick room, and a confirmation that they were not entirely alone. As the days turned into a week, then two, Silas's strength began to seep back into him, drop by precious drop. The first time he stood on his own, his legs shaking, his hand braced against the wall. Ellie and Tom watched with bated breath, as if witnessing a miracle. Soon, he was able to take a few halting steps, then to sit in the chair by the fire, and finally, to make his way to the cabin's front porch. It was there, sitting on the top step in the warm afternoon sun, that he began to truly rejoin their lives. He was still unable to work, his wounded shoulder held stiffly, his head still prone to spells of dizziness, but he could watch, and he could see. He saw the way Ellie had seamlessly taken over the running of the ranch, her movements efficient and confident. He saw her chopping wood, her brow furrowed in concentration, the muscles in her arms surprisingly strong. He saw her working in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge on her cheek, humming a soft tune. He saw the easy, affectionate way she treated Tom, ruffling his hair or sharing a quiet joke. Her laughter a sound as clear and welcome as the creek water. He watched her, and in his quiet, still observation, the deep well of his gratitude mingled with a powerful, burgeoning admiration. Ellie, in turn, was acutely aware of his gaze. It was not the possessive, assessing stare of Barlow, but something else entirely. It was a look of quiet intensity, of deep appreciation. It was a look that made her feel not judged, but truly seen. And under the warmth of that gaze, the last, tender buds of her own heart began to unfurl. Their love story was not written in passionate declarations or stolen kisses. It was written in the thousand small, unspoken gestures of a shared life. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of coffee in the morning, fixed just the way she had learned he liked it, with a little brown sugar and no milk. It was in the way he had spent a painstaking hour, his fingers still clumsy, carving a new, smoother handle for the bucket she used to haul water, because he had noticed the old one was giving her splinters. One afternoon, the sun was particularly hot. Ellie had been turning the soil in the vegetable garden, and she stopped, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, her face flushed from the exertion. Silas was sitting on the porch, as he often did, watching her. She walked to the water barrel that stood in the shade of the cabin's eaves. The cool, dark water, a blessed relief. She dipped the long-handled gourd into the barrel, brought it up dripping, and drank deeply. The water was cool and sweet. She dipped the gourd in again, this time for him. She walked over to the porch and held it out. He looked from the gourd to her face, then back again. As he reached out to take it, his calloused, scarred fingers brushed against hers. It was the lightest of touches, a fleeting moment of contact. But for Ellie, it was as if a bolt of lightning had shot up her arm. She felt the familiar, rough texture of his skin, the warmth of his hand, and in that simple, accidental touch, a universe of unspoken feeling was conveyed, a jolt of pure, unadulterated affection, a current of shared understanding that left her breathless. Their eyes met, and in his, she saw the same startled recognition, the same quiet intensity she felt in her own heart. She pulled her hand back as if from a flame, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. He took a slow drink from the gourd, his gaze never leaving her face. Their evenings took on a new, sacred quality. The day's work would be done, the animals fed, the simple supper cleared away. As twilight settled over the valley, casting long, soft shadows and turning the sky to a canvas of deep indigo and pale rose, the three of them would often find themselves outside. Tom, filled with a child's inexhaustible energy, would chase the first fireflies of the evening, his small hands cupping the blinking lights, his laughter echoing in the still air. Ellie and Silas would stand together, leaning against the smooth, worn wood of the corral fence they had mended together. They would not speak. There was no need. They would simply watch the boy, a small, joyful figure dancing in the gloaming. They stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to be aware of the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing. In these shared, silent moments, watching the boy who had become the center of their small world, they were not just a man and a woman. They were something more. They were a bulwark against the darkness, a quiet testament to the resilience of the human heart. They were a family. Raoul would visit every few days, his mule laden with a few supplies or a bit of news from the wider world. The old man's eyes, though faded with age, were sharp. They missed nothing. He saw the way Silas's gaze softened whenever Ellie entered the room. He saw the way she would instinctively check to see if Silas was comfortable, if he needed anything, her care for him as natural and as constant as breathing. He saw the easy, quiet companionship that had grown between them, a bond forged in violence and tempered in the gentle crucible of healing. One evening, Raoul was sharing their supper. He watched as Ellie dished out the stew, giving Silas a slightly larger portion, placing it before him with a small, private smile that he returned with a dip of his head. The old prospector took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes twinkling over the rim of his tin cup. He had seen many things in his long, hard life. He had seen fortunes made and lost, towns boom and bust, and more than his share of human cruelty and sorrow. He had seen men broken by the harshness of the land and the bitterness of their own hearts. But he had also, on rare occasions, seen this. He had seen the quiet, stubborn bloom of hope in the most unlikely of places. Later, as he was preparing to leave, Ellie walked with him to his mule. "He's looking stronger," Raoul said, his voice a low rumble as he tightened a strap on his saddle. "Yes," Ellie said softly, her gaze drifting back toward the cabin, where the warm lamplight spilled from the window. "Every day, a little more." Raoul stopped his work and looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. "You've been good for him. Girl, for both of them." He gestured with his chin toward the cabin. "This place, it was quiet before. Now it's settled. You brought the heart back into it." Ellie felt a blush rise to her cheeks, unused to such direct praise. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," Raoul said, his voice firm. "No, you didn't." He mounted his mule, then looked down at her, his weathered face serious in the moonlight. "You fought for it, and you fought for him. Some folks go their whole lives and never find a thing worth fighting for." He gave a small, wry smile, a crinkling of the lines around his eyes. "You take care of that boy, and you let that boy take care of you." He nudged his mule into a walk, disappearing into the darkness of the trail. Ellie stood for a long time, the old man's words echoing in her mind. She looked back at the cabin, at the simple, sturdy home that had become her entire world. The light in the window was a beacon of warmth and safety. Inside that light were the two people who had given her back her life. Raoul was right. This was a thing worth fighting for, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would fight for it with her very last breath. The fierce heat of summer softened, its sharp edges worn smooth by the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons. The days in the valley grew shorter, the golden light of late afternoon slanting lower and taking on the color of rich, dark honey. The air, once heavy with the drone of insects and the scent of baked earth, now carried a new, crisper note on the evening breeze, a hint of autumn, a promise of the coming cold. With the changing season came a change in Silas. The last vestiges of his weakness fell away, replaced by the quiet, formidable strength that was his nature. The wound on his shoulder healed into a puckered, angry-looking scar, a permanent reminder of the violence that had shattered their peace. The fogginess from his head injury cleared, leaving his eyes as sharp and observant as they had ever been. He was whole again. He moved about the ranch with his old, ground-eating stride, the silence of his presence once again one of competence and power, not of infirmity. But something fundamental had shifted between them, an irreversible change in the landscape of their small world. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just the woman he had rescued. The clear, sharp lines of their former roles had blurred, dissolving into a partnership that was as unspoken as it was absolute. They were two people who now moved in a shared orbit, their lives intertwined, their daily rhythms harmonized into a single, steady beat. The work of preparing for winter became their shared language. They worked side by side, stacking the firewood Silas had split into long, neat rows against the cabin wall. Ellie would pass him the heavy logs, her movements now strong and sure, and he would take them, his hands brushing hers, and set them into place. There was a fluid grace to their teamwork, an economy of motion born of a deep, instinctual understanding of each other. They harvested the last of the vegetables from the garden, plump orange pumpkins, hardy potatoes, and sweet, earthy carrots, and stored them in the small, cool root cellar beneath the cabin floor. They were providing for their future, for the long, cold months ahead. And every task, every shared effort was an act of faith in that future. Ellie found herself marveling at the woman she had become. She would catch her reflection in the bucket of water she carried from the creek and see not the haunted, desperate girl from the train, but a stranger with sun-streaked hair, capable hands, and eyes that were calm and clear. The fear was gone. It had not been replaced by a foolish bravery, but by a quiet, steady confidence. She had faced the monster from her past and had not been broken. She had held a gun in her trembling hands and had pulled the trigger to protect a child. She had nursed a man back from the brink of death. She had discovered a strength within herself she had never known existed, a resilience as stubborn and as surprising as the wildflower she had once pressed between the pages of a book. This newfound strength gave her the freedom to love, not with the grasping desperation of a drowning woman clinging to a raft, but with the full, open heart of a person who was whole. Her affection for Silas was a quiet, constant river that ran through the heart of her days. It was in the care she took to mend his favorite worn shirt, in the way she saved the last of the coffee for him in the morning, in the quiet joy she felt just watching him work, the late afternoon sun catching the lines of his strong back. And she saw, with a growing sense of wonder, that he was changing too. The walls he had built around himself, the fortress of solitude he had inhabited for so long, had begun to crumble. She would see it in the small, unguarded moments. She would look up from her sewing and find his eyes on her, a look of such profound, gentle tenderness in their depths that it made her heart ache. One evening, she saw him by the fire, a piece of cottonwood and his whittling knife in his hands. He was carving, his movements slow and deliberate. When he was done, he set the small object on the mantelpiece without a word. It was a perfect, tiny replica of the Indian paintbrush she had given him, its delicate petals rendered in exquisite detail. He had not only kept the flower, he had immortalized it in wood, a permanent testament to her small, silent offering. Their life was a tapestry woven from 3 threads: her quiet, nurturing presence, his solid, protective strength, and Tom's bright, youthful energy that bound them together. The boy was the heart of their home, a constant source of joy and purpose. Silas had begun to teach him in earnest, not just the practical skills of survival, but how to read and write, using the worn copy of Shakespeare and a piece of charcoal on a smoothed slab of wood. Ellie would watch them, Silas's large, scarred finger tracing the letters, his low voice patiently sounding out the words. Tom's face a mask of fierce concentration. A powerful wave of emotion would wash over her in those moments, a feeling so potent it was almost painful. This, she would think, this is what home feels like. The day came, as she knew it must, when her feelings grew too large to be contained by silence alone. It was the end of a long, satisfying day of work. They had spent the afternoon reinforcing the barn roof, patching the places where the shingles had been loosened by the summer storms. The air was cool and still, and the setting sun had set the western sky ablaze, spilling colors of fiery orange, deep rose, and soft violet across the heavens. The entire valley was bathed in a warm, ethereal glow. Tom was down at the creek, searching for the smooth, flat stones he liked to skip across the water, his distant shouts of triumph echoing faintly in the quiet air. Ellie and Silas stood on the front porch, side by side, leaning against the railing, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. They had been standing there for a long time, not speaking, simply sharing the profound peace of the moment. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a vessel, filled to the brim with all the things that had been left unsaid, with a shared memory of terror and the quiet reality of their new life. Ellie looked at Silas's profile, silhouetted against the brilliant sky. She saw the strong, square line of his jaw, the quiet competence in his posture, the way his eyes, even in repose, seemed to be taking in everything. This man, this silent, solitary stranger, had become the center of her universe. He had been her shield, her rescuer, her patient, and now he was something more, something for which she had no name. A wave of emotion, so powerful and overwhelming it was like a physical tide, rose up inside her gratitude, admiration, a deep and abiding love that was as solid and as real as the mountains surrounding them. The words came to her then, not as a planned speech, but as a simple, unadorned truth that demanded to be spoken. She turned to him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, barely more than a whisper in the vast, quiet twilight. "Silas," she began, waiting until he turned his head to look at her. His gaze was calm, questioning. "When I first met you," she said, her own gaze unwavering, "on that train, all I wanted in the world was to hide under your coat. I just wanted a dark, safe place where the world couldn't see me, where it couldn't hurt me anymore." She paused, the memory of that desperate, terrified girl a distant echo. She took a slow breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. "But I don't feel that way anymore," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. Now I just want to stand beside you, right here, out in the open." She looked out at the beautiful, fading light, then back at his shadowed face. "In the sun or in the rain, it doesn't matter, as long as I am standing beside you." It was a declaration, a confession, and a promise, all woven into a few simple sentences. She had laid her heart bare, offering him the most vulnerable, honest part of herself. She did not know what she expected. Perhaps a nod, perhaps a few gruff, mumbled words of acknowledgement. Silas did not speak. He did not move for a long, heart-stopping moment. He simply held her gaze, and in the depths of his dark, serious eyes, she saw a universe of emotion swirling surprise, understanding, and something else, something so profound and powerful it made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and at the same time, as if he had known her for his entire life. Then, slowly, with a deliberation that spoke of the immense gravity of the moment, he reached out his hand. It was not a casual gesture. It was a conscious, considered act. He took her hand in his. His hand was large, warm, and rough with the calluses of a lifetime of hard labor. It enveloped hers completely. He did not hold it loosely. He did not simply grasp her fingers. He laced his fingers through hers, his thumb coming to rest on the back of her hand, a gesture of profound and tender possession. His grip was firm, solid, and unwavering. He did not need to speak. He did not need to make a single vow. The promise was here. In the solid, living reality of his hand holding hers, it was a silent, unbreakable oath. It said, "You are not alone." It said, "I will not let you go." It said, "This is my place, and you are my partner, and here you will stay." It was the end of her running, the final, irrevocable anchoring of her soul. A single tear of pure, overwhelming joy escaped her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. They stood there on the porch as the last of the light bled from the sky and the first stars began to prick the deep, velvet darkness. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood together, hand in hand, two solitary, broken people who had found in each other a solace more profound than any sanctuary, a commitment more binding than any spoken word. The grasp of his hand was her home, and it was a promise that would last a lifetime. The passing of that evening on the porch was not an event, but a transition. It was like the quiet, imperceptible moment when the tide turns. The conversation held in the clasp of their hands was the last one they would ever need to have. From that day forward, the question of their future was no longer a question. It was a simple, established fact, as solid and as real as the granite mountains that cradled their valley. The love between them was no longer a fragile, burgeoning thing to be nurtured in secret. It was the air they breathed, the ground they walked upon, the steady, unspoken rhythm of their lives. Winter came, blanketing the valley in a deep, pristine silence. The world outside their cabin was a study in white and gray. the creek frozen into a ribbon of black ice, the mighty oaks standing as bare, intricate skeletons against the pale sky. But inside, the small log home was an island of warmth and life. The fire in the hearth, which Silas kept roaring, was a constant, cheerful presence. The shelves were stocked with the fruits of their summer labor, and the air was filled with the scents of baking bread, simmering stew, and the clean, sharp fragrance of the pine logs burning on the grate. It was a time of quiet intimacy, of drawing inward. The harshness of the season only served to strengthen the bonds between the three of them. Silas, his strength fully returned, spent his days mending harnesses, carving new tools, and teaching Tom the intricate art of tying knots and reading a winter sky. Ellie transformed the cabin from a spare, masculine shelter into a true home. She stitched new curtains for the windows from bleached flour sacks, their simple pattern a cheerful contrast to the snow outside. She found wild herbs, dried them, and hung them from the rafters, filling the cabin with a subtle, pleasant aroma. She discovered a surprising talent for storytelling, and in the long, dark evenings, she would sit by the fire and spin tales for Tom, not the grim, cautionary fables of her past, but bright, hopeful stories of brave children and magical animals, stories she invented from the deep well of her own healed imagination. And through it all, her connection with Silas deepened, becoming a thing of profound, quiet beauty. There was no grand passion, no fiery romance. Theirs was a love built on the solid bedrock of shared experience and mutual respect. It was a love that found its expression in the smallest of gestures. It was in the way he would rise early to start the fire so the cabin would be warm for her when she woke. It was in the way she would leave his mended shirt on his bunk, a small wildflower tucked into the pocket. It was in the shared glances across the crowded space, glances that spoke of a deep, abiding contentment that needed no words. When the snows finally began to melt, and the first tentative signs of spring returned to the valley, it felt like a collective awakening. The creek broke free from its icy prison with a roar, and the first green shoots of grass pushed their way through the damp, dark earth. A sense of new beginnings filled the air, and with it came a shared, unspoken desire to build, to create, to put down roots so deep they could never be torn up again. The work they had done before had been about survival and repair. The work they did now was about creation. They did not just mend the old barn. They decided to build a new, larger one, a testament to their faith in the future. With Raoul's occasional help, they felled trees from the high slopes, squared them into logs, and, through a long, arduous process of sweat and shared effort, raised the new structure from the ground up. It was hard, back-breaking work, but it was joyful work. Their laughter echoed in the valley, a sound as bright and as new as the spring leaves on the cottonwood trees. Ellie claimed a new patch of land near the creek, a sunny, fertile spot that had been choked with weeds. She and Tom worked for weeks to clear it, their hands and clothes perpetually stained with the rich, dark soil. This was not to be just a vegetable garden. This was to be a place of beauty. She planted seeds she had carefully saved, and others that Raoul had brought her from a trading post, marigolds and zinnias, lavender and larkspur. It was a defiant act of creation, a declaration that their lives would not just be about survival, but about joy. They whitewashed the outside of the cabin, the bright, clean white, a stark and beautiful contrast to the dark, weathered logs. Tom, in his childish enthusiasm, managed to get as much whitewash on himself as he did on the walls. Ellie, laughing, wiped a white smudge from his nose, and then turned to find Silas watching her, a rare, wide smile on his face. He reached out and gently wiped a stray fleck of white from her own cheek, his thumb lingering for a heart-stopping second on her skin. It was a simple, playful moment, a moment of such easy, domestic intimacy that it brought tears to her eyes. This was the life she had never even dared to dream of, a life of shared work, of easy laughter, of a love that was as gentle and as reliable as the rising of the sun. The seasons turned again. The new barn stood tall and proud, smelling of fresh-cut pine. Ellie's garden exploded into a riot of color, a vibrant, fragrant paradise that buzzed with the happy industry of bees. Tom grew taller, his face losing its childish roundness, his solemnity now tempered with a frequent, easy smile. He was a child of the valley, as sure-footed and as knowledgeable as any boy twice his age, his past a distant shadow, his future as bright and as open as the wide New Mexico sky. One late summer evening, as the sun began its slow, majestic descent, casting the world in a warm, golden light, Ellie stood at the edge of her flower garden. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and warm earth. Silas came to stand beside her, his chores for the day done. Tom was down by the new barn, proudly showing Raoul a birdhouse he had built, his voice carrying on the still air. Ellie looked out at the scene before her, the sturdy, whitewashed cabin, the strong, new barn, the riot of color in her garden, the boy who was the living heart of it all, and the man standing beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth at her side. This was the world they had built together, a world of peace and beauty, created from the ashes of their broken pasts. "Do you remember?" she said softly, not looking at him, her eyes on the riot of flowers. "That first flower I gave you, the one growing out of the rock." He was silent for a moment. Then his low, rumbling voice came, laced with a warmth that was now as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "I remember. I thought it was the most beautiful, stubborn thing I had ever seen," she said, a smile in her voice. "But I was wrong. This," she made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the garden, the barn, the entire valley. "This is the most beautiful thing." He did not reply with words. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers in that familiar, comforting way that had become the anchor of her world. They stood there in silence as the sun sank lower, a great, molten orb of gold that set the clouds on fire. The light washed over them, turning the petals of the flowers to jewels, gilding the leaves of the cottonwood trees, and casting their own long shadows on the rich, dark earth. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke of 1,000 shared nights and 1,000,000 unspoken affections. He was her rock, her shelter, her home. She thought back to that desperate, terrifying moment on the train, when all she had wanted was to hide from the world. She remembered the darkness under his coat, the smell of dust and wool, the feeling of his solid presence shielding her from the ugliness that pursued her. The coat had been a curtain, a temporary shield drawn against the world. But now, as she stood in the open, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, her hand held fast in his, she understood. The real sanctuary was not a place to hide. It was a place to live, to grow, to love. The true frame of her new life was not a curtain of wool and dust, but the sturdy porch of their shared home, the open window that let in the morning sun, the vast, beautiful expanse of the valley they had made their own. And as they stood together, two quiet figures in a sea of wildflowers, their story, which had begun in the desperate, silent prose of survival, had finally, beautifully, transformed into poetry. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover it. Your support means the world to us.